against Protestants who dared to support the doctrines of the Reformation. One prominent Protestant, William Prynne, had his ears twice cut off. Then the stumps of his ears were dug out. Others were flogged. Their noses were slit in public, and their faces were branded with hot irons. Laud was eventually found guilty of conspiring with Jesuits to bring England back under popery, and was put to death for treason. Among his private papers was found a letter addressed to the Jesuit superior in Brussels. The Jesuits would also continue Rome's centuries-old persecution of the Waldenses in their dogged attempts to finally annihilate them. Several of the reformers explained why Rome hated them. Theodore Beza called the Waldenses the very seed of the primitive and pure church. He said they never adhered to papal superstition, for which reason they have been continually harassed by bishops and inquisitors, so that their continuance is evidently miraculous. Meanwhile, Heinrich Bullinger said, throughout the world, the Waldenses have sustained their profession of the gospel of Christ. In several of their writings, as well as by continual preaching, they have accused the Pope as the real Antichrist foretold by the Apostle John. They have consistently and openly given testimony to their faith by glorious martyrdoms, and still do even to this day.
The most well-known persecution of the Waldenses happened in the year 1655, and it was really the armies of the Duke of Savoy, who was another papal puppet, who was sent in to wipe these people out once and for all. Now the Waldenses managed to resist the first attack, but then again with Jesuit subtlety the Catholics resorted to a different tactic, and they persuaded the Waldenses that they would have another army which would come in to protect them. And sadly the Waldenses believed this, and when the troops, these Vatican troops, were billeted amongst the Waldenses, they turned on them and carried out the most horrific massacre. And it's known in history as the massacre of the Piedmont, and it's even commemorated by the English poet John Milton, and was called on the late massacre at Piedmont to commemorate the sufferings of the Waldenses. And there are some famous lines which go, "Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold, even they who kept thy truth so pure of old, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones," that is to say, idols. And surviving Waldenses actually appealed, or managed to appeal, to Oliver Cromwell, who was at the time the Lord Protector of England, for protection. And Oliver Cromwell successfully managed to negotiate with Cardinal Mazarin of France to actually get the persecution lifted. But I think it's worth remembering the words, indeed the eyewitness account, of one of the Waldensian pastors, Jean Léger. He actually tried to persuade his Waldensian fellow believers that they should not fall for Rome's duplicity, which then, as I said, resulted in the massacre. After the massacre, he managed to escape. He came and tried as best he could as a Christian pastor to minister to these shocked survivors. And he even wrote about it, and he said that the tears mingle with my ink when I write about these deeds of darkness, yea, worse even than the deeds of the Prince of Darkness himself, because he saw firsthand the horrible cruelties that these Catholics had inflicted on these innocent Bible believers.
During the Middle Ages, the Jesuits were, without question, the most radical society ever conceived. Professor Arthur Noble writes, "So great, in fact, was the mischief done by the Jesuits that they were expelled from over 70 countries, 4/5 of which were Roman Catholic, and they were cursed and denounced for their hypocrisy by 11 popes. The society was repeatedly repressed and became known and feared for their revenge." In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, John Adams wrote, "My history of the Jesuits is in 4 volumes. The work is anonymous because, as I suppose, the author was afraid, as all the monarchs of Europe were, of Jesuitical assassination." Pope Clement XIV suppressed the order in 1773 by a perpetual decree, and while signing the papal bull, he remarked, "I am signing my death warrant." A year later, he died by poisoning and is said to have perished in great agony. But for Rome, the real stronghold of the Reformation was in England. The Jesuits made more than 25 attempts on the life of Queen Elizabeth I and tried repeatedly to invade the country with foreign armies. The reason for their tenacity was summed up by Cardinal Manning in 1859, who said, "England is the head of Protestantism, the center of its movements, and the stronghold of its power. Weakened in England, it is paralyzed everywhere. Conquered in England, it is conquered throughout the world. Once overthrown here, all else is but a warfare of detail." To understand the Jesuit goal, we must consider the statue of founder Ignatius Loyola, which can be found inside St. Peter's in Rome. Loyola stands with an open book in his hand. On one side is written the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. On the other side is a Latin phrase meaning "to the greater glory of God." Meanwhile, the Jesuit's foot is found on the neck of a wild-haired figure with a serpent beneath him. The figure is said to symbolize Protestantism. Notice that Protestantism has a book beneath his arm. While there are no discernible markings on it, we ask the viewer to consider what that book might be as we unfold the following evidence. Through the Middle Ages, the source of Protestant authority was the Holy Bible, the words of God which justified all rejection of the papacy. The Bible became known as the paper pope of Protestantism, a term of derision applied by Rome. To counter the authority of the Bible, the Jesuits developed a confession for Protestants to make who converted to Roman Catholicism. Protestant converts were made to say, "We confess that whatever new thing the Pope of Rome may have instituted, whether it be in Scripture or out of Scripture, is true, divine, and full of salvation, and therefore ought to be regarded as of higher value by lay people than even the precepts of the living God. We confess that the Pope has power of altering Scripture or increasing or diminishing it according to his will. We confess that the most holy Pontiff ought to be honored by all with divine honor, with more prostration than even what is due to Christ himself." Let the viewer consider that these confessions are confirmed by a number of sources in the 19th and 20th centuries. We only one of them here. On the intellectual front, the Jesuits were largely behind the Council of Trent, which began in 1545.
Yes, the Counter-Reformation really got underway to a major extent when Pope Paul III convened what became known in history as the Council of Trent. And the council actually ran in, I think, at least 3 sessions for 18 years up until the the year 1563.
Trent was specifically designed to refute the doctrines and teachings of the Reformation.
So whatever the Reformers were for, the Jesuits were against.
The key point of contention was the issue of grace and salvation. The council declared that if anyone says that men obtain from God through faith alone the grace of justification, let him be anathema. It is worth noting that the declarations of Trent were reconfirmed by Vatican Council II in the 20th century. Vatican II is the most up-to-date doctrinal declaration from Rome. But also on the agenda at Trent were the Jesuits' attacks against the Bibles, which had been translated by the Reformers.
And the council was certainly dominated by the Jesuits, who, as I've said before, captured the universities and majored in academic and intellectual endeavours, and it was by their intellectualism and their scholarship that they ultimately aimed to discredit the Protestant Bibles. Well, they dominated the council, and it appears that the major resolutions of the council were all against the pure Bibles, the Protestant scriptures.
In his book on the history of the English Bible, author Benson Bobrick writes that the Council of Trent had declared the Vulgate not only better than all other Latin translations, but better than the Greek text itself in those places where they disagree.
And it appears also that what the council did was to actually take from the writings of none other than the great reformer Martin Luther, and they just condemned these directly. For example, they condemned the belief that the apocryphal books, which are in the Catholic Bibles as part of the Old Testament, they condemned the belief that the apocryphal books were not scripture, and they were quite prepared to punish by death any so-called heretic who said that the apocryphal books were not scripture.
Now it is true that the Apocrypha was in the early Bibles. I have early Bibles in my office just across the hallway where you see the Apocrypha was, some people say it's not, but in the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, the Apocrypha was there. And previous to that, in the Geneva Bible, the Apocrypha was there, except in some bootleg editions of the 1599 where it was left out. But mind you, it was never to be accepted on the level of Scripture. It was never considered to be inspired, while the Roman Catholic Church makes a pronouncement that it is.
But Rome and her Jesuits would not be content with merely condemning Protestant doctrine. They intended to counter the Reformation Bibles.
The next step of the Jesuits was to produce their own version in English of the New Testament that became known as the Jesuit Reims version, because it was compiled by Jesuit scholars in the town of Reims in France, and later on it became known as the Douay Reims version.
The Jesuits inserted curious words and footnotes into their translation, in part to justify Catholic doctrine.
That's why they worked so hard to translate the Douay Reims Bible, because in Matthew chapter 6, instead of saying like Wycliffe did, like Tyndale did, like the Geneva Bible, give us this day our daily bread, they say, give us this day our supersubstantial bread. And so they change, and the Greek word is not supersubstantial whatsoever, but nonetheless they do that to be able to support their doctrine of transubstantiation.
The Douay Reims also countered the Reformers' view that the Church of Rome had been mass murdering the saints through the Inquisition. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 6, where it describes Mystery Babylon, saying she is drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, the Jesuit footnote reads, "But the blood of Protestants is not called the blood of saints, no more than the blood of thieves, man-killers, and other malefactors, for the shedding of which, by the order of justice, no commonwealth shall answer." Oddly enough, the Douay-Rheims also acknowledged that the Whore of Babylon symbolized the city of Rome. But they insist it must have been pagan Rome during the time of Nero.